We're beginning Chapter 21, Marburg, Ebola, and chilling propaganda in the hot zone of emerging viruses, AIDS and Ebola, nature, accident, or intentional. In late March, we made our way back from sunny Florida to New England. Again, my seminar schedule gave us 3 leisurely days, which I spent exploring the libraries of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The ladies spent time admiring the blossom-bedecked town as its spring peak. Though their assignment was less confining, I assure you mine was far more engaging. My first day's assignment was to track down the Marburg virus along with Ebola Zaire and Ebola Sudan. All were relative newcomers to the virology scene. All were believed to be HIV relatives, if only from their decade of common emergence. Marburg had struck 3 vaccine production facilities almost simultaneously in 1967. 2 outbreaks occurred in 2 West German cities, another in Yugoslavia. Oddly, the virus then disappeared until 1975, when it once again reared its ugly head in all places of South Africa. Then, less than 2 years later, 2 larger outbreaks erupted in southern Sudan and northern Zaire. Here's the map. I thought it curious that European outbreaks occurred virtually simultaneously in 1967, and then 8 years later in South Africa. I knew that to be about the time Gallo and his colleague at the National Cancer Institute, Little Bionetics, Merck, and allegedly OTRAG, and OTRAG was Orbital Transport and Missiles Ltd., began experimenting with similar viruses to produce an assortment of potential bioweapons. Moreover, the Sudan and Zaire outbreak areas were literally war zones, and South Africa was not too far off geographically and militarily. So I began my search for Marburg's origin with these factors in mind. In Search of Marburg, a med-layer research at the UNC Medical Library immediately led me to an abstract in October 1977 issue of Tropical Diseases Bulletin. The text discussed 3 papers that described the isolation and characterization of the Marburg virus from the blood of a Zairean patient who became ill during a large outbreak of hemorrhagic fever in northern Zaire and southern Sudan in the second half of 1976. Material from Zaire was originally sent to Antwerp, Belgium, and from there specimens were dispatched to Portendown and Atlanta. Portendown was England's biowarfare laboratory, and Antwerp was close to where Gallo had presented his research before NATO on the entry of foreign nucleic acids into cells in 1970. Antwerp was, therefore, likely to have been another Western Alliance biological weapons research lab. The Tropical Diseases Bulletin reported that the 3 viruses, Marburg, Ebola, Zaire, and Ebola Sudan, were morphologically indistinguishable, although antibody studies confirmed distinct differences between the strains that broke out in Germany and Yugoslavia in 1967 and those that hit the Ebola River Valley in 1976. Thus, the Sudan and Zaire strains were named Ebola to distinguish them from the original Marburg virus. Another reference I reviewed that morning was the Marburg virus by Rudolf Seigert, who was affiliated with the Hygiene Institute of the Philipps University in Marburg, Lahn, Germany. Seigert, caught up in the mystery of Marburg, explained, "In Europe, no new diseases have been observed in many decades. Thus, a mysterious hemorrhagic fever which broke out simultaneously in Germany and Yugoslavia in 1967 simulated stimulated considerable interest. It posed a demanding challenge for clinicians, microbiologists, epidemiologists, and the public health service. The disease appeared in mid-August and affected 31 persons in Marburg, Lahn, Frankfurt, Main, and Belgrade. 7 cases ended in death. At first, only employees of the Beringwerk and Paul Ehrlich Institute and the Institute for Sera and Vaccines, Torlak, became ill. The common source of the infections was soon traced to certain shipments of monkeys. Cercopithecus, Aethiops from Uganda, and there can be no doubt that the pathogen responsible for the Marburg monkey diseases fulfills the morphologic and biologic criteria for a virus. This is indicated by its cell-dependent replication, as well as its complex structure and helical symmetry. The genetic material is RNA. Seigert agreed with most authors that the structural pattern of the Marburg virus exhibited many features similar to a group of viruses known as rhabdoviruses. These included the culprits responsible for rabies and vesicular stomatitis. Vesicular stomatitis. A more technical name for the Marburg virus was coined from the monkeys who passed it to the victims in Marburg, Rhabdovirus simiae. The Marburg virus expert described the horrifying clinical features of the disease and then focused on several specific cases. In one instance, a nurse who had no contact with a victim's blood became infected. Seigert thus concluded it seemed likely that she acquired the infection by way of contaminated air or contact with excreta. Reporting on the epidemiology of the European outbreak, Seigert noted that although all the infected monkeys had died or had been slaughtered, the killer germ had been identified from cell cultures obtained and frozen before the monkeys were incinerated. At least 10 infected monkeys were believed to have been responsible for the 20 cases among Marburg veterinarians and animal caretakers. Frankfurt's cases were traced to 2 more monkeys from the same animal catching station in Uganda, and those in Belgrade were infected by 1 more, Seigert continued. 4 shipments were determined as possible sources, and they had arrived in Europe between July 20th and August 10th, 1967, and comprised a total of 500 to 600 animals. Their distribution to the affected institutions was quite various. Frankfurt received only 10%, and this small number in 2 batches. It is hardly likely that all the monkeys were infected from the start. In that case, an increased mortality would be expected, which was reported only from Belgrade. Presumably, the infection spread during the course of 3 weeks in the groups of monkeys kept in quarantine for 25 days in Belgrade and in Marburg for up to 29 days. The animals probably became contagious 5 to 8 days after exposure. Even if we assume this minimal time, the first monkeys must have acquired the infection before their arrival. In cases involving several monkeys in separate cages in the same room, aerogenic transmission is suspected. Human cases of Marburg disease, Seigert explained, had only been reported in Germany and in Yugoslavia, although numerous shipments of monkeys from the same dealer was sent simultaneously from Uganda to USA, Italy, Japan, Sweden, and Switzerland, emphasis added. This prompted a Central African investigation wherein no evidence was found that the disease had occurred in animals or natives there. Thus, most experts concluded that the reservoir of the Marburg virus, although not found in Cercopithecus aethiops or other animals, must be the native habitat of of the monkeys in Africa. So the virus did not make it home in monkeys. It resided somewhere in the local habitat of Central Africa. How interesting. I thought, knowing Uganda was just across the border from Orbital Transport and Missiles Ltd base. I wonder if Orbital Transport and Missiles Ltd or Littleton Bionetics rhabdovirus experiments might have infected the monkeys that were later sent to labs in Europe. Odd that Seigert didn't mention the name of the monkey dealer. He documented everything else meticulously. Obviously, it had to have been a large facility to simultaneously ship 500 to 600 animals. A bogus United States antigen. What Seigert documented next was even more remarkable. The CDC apparently sabotaged international efforts to locate the source of the outbreak, Seigert wrote. Monkeys themselves do not seem to be the probable natural reservoir of the virus, since, in spite of their widespread use in experiments, transmission of this hemorrhagic fever in laboratories has not been otherwise observed. The fact that all infections of monkeys proved lethal under experimental conditions after minimal dosages also supports this contention. For this reason, it came as a great surprise when the CDC serial epidemiologic studies indicated a wide distribution of the Marburg virus, not only among monkeys from Central Africa, but also among those from Asia. These findings, Seigert explained at length, were highly inconsistent. Blood studies using guinea pigs-derived antibodies run by the Special Virus Studies Laboratory of the CDC in 1968 indicated that of 129 African green monkeys from Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, 50% reacted positively. Furthermore, no differences were found between animals imported into the USA and those studied immediately following the capture. The same percentage of antibody carriers was also determined in a limited number of chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, according to the CDC researchers, but numerous other international studies failed to show this high presence of Marburg virus in the blood samples of various monkey species. Moreover, Dr. Seymour Coulter, director of the Southwest Foundation for Research, America's premier simian monkey lab, questioned the inconsistency Seigert observed. It didn't seem possible, he explained, with such high titers of antibody against Marburg infection demonstrated by the CDC, that neither illness nor excessive mortality was observed. During experiments, monkeys exposed with rhabdovirus simiae developed antibodies and died shortly after. Coulter, Seigert, and others therefore questioned, with such widespread contamination, it is difficult to imagine why no cases have occurred until now involving humans having close contact with monkeys. The explanation ultimately focused on the specificity of the antigen used to detect the antibodies diagnostic for Marburg infection. To study the problem, Coulter and another group of researchers compared the CDC's guinea pig-derived antigen with those developed from monkeys infected with the Marburg virus. The results proved that the United States antigen probably contained a second component not specific for Marburg virus. Thus, the CDC research methods and materials were faulted for producing falsely positive test results, Seigert wrote. The authors are convinced that the Marburg virus is absent among the two other species of monkeys studied in South Africa, or others at most only to a limited extent. Other researchers point out the possibility that the antibodies might not only have been directed against the Marburg virus, but simultaneously against a less pathogenic related virus which circulated in Uganda at the same time, emphasis added. So they would take the Marburg virus and culture it onto this virus that's going around that's less pathogenic, sort of like this coronavirus thing that's going on now. And you can piggyback another virus onto another virus and then culture it in human tissue and make it adaptable for human beings. Interesting. In other words, the CDC developed a testing procedure that led the international scientific community astray. The allegedly innocent mistake prompted researchers to conclude the Marburg agent commonly infected monkeys throughout the world. Thus, scientists were beguiled, and the issue remained confused during the first crucial years of the investigation when interest in the outbreak peaked. Even more suspect was the fact that the CDC's testing reagent, the United States antigen, contained a Marburg-like less pathogenic related virus that had been circulating in Uganda at the same time the deadly germ infected the monkeys destined for Europe, meaning the CDC had manipulated a different but related, less deadly virus from Uganda to produce the bogus United States antigen. Thus, using Streckert's metaphor again, the CDC had dressed a quadriplegic infant in disguise, except this time when it arrived at the party, partygoers saw through the disguise and knew the CDC had dressed and delivered the baby. These findings were reinforced, Seigert wrote, when researchers finally developed an optimally effective and specific antigen to detect the Marburg virus. With this preparation, no antibody was found in any of the 136 monkeys from Uganda and South Africa, or in 25 serum samples which had been found positive by other teams using the CDC's United States antigen. For this reason, Seigert concluded, it seems inappropriate to refer to the Marburg virus as a simian virus so long as its origin remains unclear. Determination of the virus reservoir is one of the most important tasks yet to be accomplished. It is not possible that a unique chance event is involved. For this reason, the risk of future outbreaks cannot yet be determined. The World Health Organization on Marburg. Another text I found that morning at the UNC's medical library was a 1977 WHO publication written by Dr. I.H. Simpson from the Department of Medical Microbiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Simpson had led one of the WHO dispatch teams to the Ebola region of Zaire during the 1976 outbreak. Although Simpson's text lacked the depth of Seigert's, he did provide a few more interesting details about the obscure origins and virus reservoirs of Marburg, and the possible infection routes through intact skin and the air. Simpson also described the alarming case fatality rate that occurred during the Ebola outbreaks. Between July and November 1976, two very extensive and almost simultaneous epidemics of a similar disease occurred about 1,000 kilometers apart in southern Sudan and northern Zaire. Secondary and tertiary person-to-person spread of the infection was a distinct feature of these outbreaks, particularly among hospital staff. In some cases in Sudan, as many as 8 generations of infection were found, but this was unusual. There are believed to have been over 300 cases, with 151 deaths in Sudan, and in Zaire some 237 cases, with 211 fatalities have been documented. The actual numbers may be greater. In one Sudanese hospital, 76 members of a staff of 230 were infected and 41 died. Throughout the Zaire epidemic and during the earlier stages of the Sudanese outbreak, the case fatality rate was of the order of almost 90%, leading to fear and panic in the local populations. These alarming figures emphasized the tremendous public health importance of this disease. The outbreak in Sudan is thought to have been the first week. I gotta start this over. I butchered that whole thing. The outbreak in Sudan is thought to have begun in the first week of July 1976, with the illness of a cloth room storekeeper in a cotton factory in Nazada, Western Equatorial Province. 2 weeks later, the second storekeeper also became ill, following a further 2 weeks later by another cotton factory employee. Now, one of his contacts introduced the disease to Marberge, some distance east of Nazara. The source of the original infection has still not been determined. The infection spread swiftly, but only through close and prolonged household contact with an active case. Health personnel in particular were involved through contact with patients' blood, and Maridi Hospital acted as an amplifier of the disease. When good nursing techniques, supplemented by the use of protective clothing, were introduced, the number of contact infections fell dramatically. In Zaire, the first recognized case occurred during the first weeks of September 1976 and is thought to have originated at a small mission hospital in Yambuku, just north of Yadonaj, Equateur region. It is thought that parentero through the skin injections may have played a role in transmission. Patients infected in the hospital environment probably then carried the infection back to their villages, setting up new pockets of infections in their homes. The house of the infection in Zaire remains unknown, but it may have been introduced to Yambuku by a patient presenting at the outpatient clinic with a nonspecific febrile illness. Besides acknowledging the similarity of Marburg viruses to the rhabdoviridae, Seigert also mentioned the possibility that the germs, given their large size and unmistakable appearance, could have evolved from a whole roster of plant viruses. I recalled that because of their large size, plant viruses were among the first viruses studied and manipulated by National Cancer Institute researchers, including Robert Gallo's team. Thus, it seemed even more plausible that the natural reservoir of the Ebola and Marburg viruses was in the NCI laboratories. Walter Royal Davis Library. Fortunately, as it turns out, UNC's medical library did not hold the vast majority of references the computer provided. Several were history texts, and the rest were government documents. To retrieve these, a kindly librarian told me I need to visit Walter Royal Davis Library a few blocks away. So I packed my gear and headed over to the campus's main library. A dimly lit upper floor of Davis housed the German history books. After several minutes of pursuing its stacks, I came upon 2 texts about Marburg, both in German. With my rusting memory of conversational German, I plowed through the books in search of clues. They were either non-existent or I missed them. I rode the elevator back to the first floor, confident that Davis held more for me than dead ends. The government documents department was my next home. My first objective was to locate a 5-volume set entitled Virology. The texts were written by a task force from the National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases and published by the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1979. I presented the citation to a librarian, who said she would retrieve the books in the library's basement. She turned left and 5 minutes later returned with virology. "Are you going to be doing more research in this department?" she asked. "Very possibly over the next 2 days," I said. "Then you may as well get a pass to the basement so you can access references yourself." Twist my arm, I thought, knowing that special treasures always happen wherever I roam such places. See the fellow at the end of the counter. He'll issue you a pass. I took her advice. Then I claimed an empty desk and began to read virology. The sections dealing with Marburg and Ebola basically reviewed what I had already learned. Several parts of virology, though, were very interesting. I learned one most important fact. Researchers preferred working with simian monkey SV40 viruses before they were the more malleable and better characterized, which made them easier to clone and propagate specific fragments of foreign DNA in mammalian cells. Evolution of species. Virology also explained that during the late 1960s, researchers advanced a new theory of evolution. Some believed that evolution of species was not much based on survival of the fittest. Viruses were thought to play a more important role. Researchers proposed that foreign DNA transmitted to a plant and animal hosts by virus caused organisms to evolve. Thus, viruses were not only believed to hold the key to vaccine development and disease prevention, but to human evolution as well. Many researchers claimed that through future research on viral evolution, a genetically superior race of humans may be synthetically evolved. In the task force's jargon, further exploration of the molecular paleontology of endogenous retroviruses could help elucidate the processes of speciation. I really fucked that up, didn't I? The further exploration of molecular paleontology of endogenous retroviruses could help elucidate the processes of speciation. Retroviruses, the report continued, were particularly important in this regard. Studies on the evolution of viruses had alleged provided new evidence in support of the theory that man originated in Asia rather than in Africa. Taking particular pride in this evidence, the authors then commented that accommodations between host and viral parasites are alleged to have played a major role in the political and economic development of civilizations. The hot zone. Early that evening, I caught up with my family for dinner. Jackie and Alina had spent part of the day shopping and had bought Daddy a gift. The Hot Zone by Richard Peterson. I had heard about this allegedly true account of the famous Hazleton monkey house outbreak of the dreaded resistant Ebola-like virus, and I was finishing up work on Deadly Innocence. I just hadn't gotten around to reading it since it seemed off the subject of AIDS. Now, however, the time seemed perfect. So that night in a motel, as the girls watched television and drifted off to sleep, I started and finished The Hot Zone. For a nonfiction book, the Random House publication had remained on the New York Times bestseller list far longer than even most works of fiction. Preston, the author of an earlier book entitled American Steel, about the Nucor Corporation and its project to build a revolutionary steel mill, won several awards for his writing, including the prestigious American Institute of Physics Award and the McDermott Award in the Arts from MIT. Massachusetts. I forget what that. Look up MIT if you want to know what it means. I know it's a highly technical school. I just forgot what the acronym means. Something about Massachusetts. How this investigative journalist with no medical background had gone from revealing revolutionary steel industry accomplishments to viral epidemics struck me as suspicious, especially since I knew the steel industry had been targeted by Bobby Kennedy for investigation because of widespread corruption and had in its ranks Soviet military order of multi-Nazi linked industrialists, including John Farrell, the past president of the U.S. Steel. My suspicions grew feverish. The hot zone, I realized, omitted almost all of the relevant scientific facts. Preston completely overlooked the extraordinary research environments in which the AIDS, Marburg, and Ebola and Reston viruses emerged. He gave no hint to the covert military operations that had permeated Central Africa at the time of the major Ebola outbreaks in 1976. He wrote nothing of the political forces affecting African development and population control at the time. He failed to mention the numerous United States Assistance for International Development sponsored immunization programs and widespread vaccine experiments that ran through the AIDS belt and the 16 Central West African countries. Apparently, he felt this was immaterial for his terrifying true story. Indeed, the hot zone was a labor of devout censorship. The only logical explanation for Preston's treatise is that the CIA and military medical industrial complex had persuaded the author to produce a marvelous piece of yellow press and acquired Random House to publish it. Preston and patrons of the hot zone clearly wanted people to know that the world might soon be plagued by viruses far more deadly than AIDS, and to prepare for the worst. What frightened me most about the realization was the probability that those who fanned such fears would make good on their threats. Yeah. Viral propaganda. The hot zone's main thesis would be laughable were it not for its seriousness. Through exceptionally gruesome prose, Preston advanced the notion that new human immune system ravaging germs most likely emerged from bat guano on the floor of Kituum Cave in southwestern Kenya during the mid-1970s. The viruses were then allegedly picked up by neighboring monkeys and delivered around the world by African animal traders. Preston lost his credibility in the hot zone's opening chapter when he discussed the initial outbreak of the deadly Marburg Virus Ebola strain. He alleged the virus claimed its first victim, Charles Monnet, a Frenchman whose job Preston claimed was to take care of the sugar factory's water pumping machinery. In nauseating detail, Preston described Monnet's alleged sojourn. Monnet then died at Nairobi Hospital, but not before vomiting into the eyes and mouth of Dr. Shemuskwe, who 9 days later allegedly broke with the infection too. Terrifying, yes. True story? Hardly. By Simpson's scientific and more accurate account, Ebola's first victim was a cloth room storekeeper in a cotton factory in Nazara, Western Equatorial Province. 2 weeks later, a second storekeeper also became ill, followed a further 2 weeks later by another cotton factory employee. Giving Preston the benefit of the doubt, he had made a mistake. Had he thought the Zaire outbreak was Ebola's first, and then he should have described events emanating from Yambuku's and not Nairobi's hospital. Marburg, Preston continued, is an African organism, but it has a German name. Viruses are named for the place where they were first discovered. Marburg is an old city in central Germany, surrounded by forests and meadows where factories nestled in green valleys. The virus erupted there in 1976 in a factory called Bedding Works, which produced vaccines using kidney cells from African green monkeys. The Bedding Works regularly imported monkeys from Uganda. The virus came to Germany hidden somewhere in a series of air shipments of monkeys totaling 500 or 600 animals. As few as 200 or 300 of the animals were incubating the virus. They were probably not even visibly sick, Preston speculated. At any rate, meaning I'm not sure, but let's continue with this allegedly true account anyway. Shortly afterward they arrived, the virus began to spread among them, and a few of them crashed and bled out. Soon afterward, the Marburg agent jumped species and suddenly emerged in the human population of the city. This is an example of virus amplification. Propaganda is a more accurate description of this example, I thought, realizing it was highly unlikely that quality European vaccine producers would rely on such careless monkey traders to supply their animals. As I realized earlier that day, and Preston later noted, the supplier undoubtedly would have maintained a large quarantine monkey facility in order to be exporting so many expensive monkeys around the world at one time. Given the bizarre nature and extreme virulence of the germ, it was far more likely then that Department of Defense and National Cancer Institute biological weapons contractors like Littleton Bionetics or Orbital Transport and Missiles Ltd. had slipped up somehow and European vaccine workers paid the price. As Gallo and numerous others published, and the Army's Director of Defense Research and Engineering explained, cancer-causing monkey viruses were being manipulated at the exact time, and for the first time in history, simultaneously in Uganda, Bethesda, New York, and elsewhere. At this time, the new infected microorganisms that differed from any known disease-causing organisms were being produced by the billions. Many were likely to have escaped accidentally. Fort Detrick's accidental record, for instance, was appalling. Oh my goodness. And into 2019, they accidentally left the door open of a biosafety level 4 lab. And the leader, not the leader, but the guy in charge, Sina Bavari, he later quits and then goes to, someplace in the Netherlands, like that book talks about, where they started aerosolizing some avian influenza. But yeah, he created 4 startup companies under technology that he was working on at Fort Detrick. So I don't know how that's not like a crime, but whatever. Even physician Robert Cook's fictional account of the source of these viruses in outbreak noted a military origin. Wait a minute. I'm skipping stuff. For Fort Detrick's accident, I'm just going to reread it. Fort Detrick's accident record, for instance, was appalling. I recall that during the 1969 congressional hearings on chemical and biological warfare, senators learned that at Fort Detrick, some 3,000 accidents were recorded between 1954 and 1962. Half of these in laboratories involving the infection of more than 500 men. There was even one case of a worker who caught plague. One physician, Robert Cook's fictional account of the source of these virus in outbreak, noted a military origin and purpose. Preston's account, therefore, seemed an insult to medical intelligence and common sense, explaining that the Hazelton Monkey House was generally considered a safe haven for monkey immigrants. Much of Preston's book detailed the hysteria that ensued when a honker from Zaire resembling Ebola broke out among one floor of African monkeys from the Philippines. What was it doing near Washington? One of Preston's characters questioned. How the hell has it gotten here? What would it do? I'm onto something really hot. Preston explained that an unidentified African monkey dealer had sold the hot monkeys to a Philippine wholesaler who dealt with the U.S. military. To his credit, Preston explained that the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick was at the Hazelton Monkey House's chief customer. What? House's chief customer? Oh, okay. To his credit, Preston explained that the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick was the Hazelton Monkey House's chief customer. That makes sense. The operation, he noted, was owned and operated by Hazelton Research Products, a division of Dow Corning Incorporated. Whew, I need something to drink. What he failed to mention was that besides monkeys, Hazelton Research Products sold monkey viruses to military scientists. The National Cancer Institute's retrovirus chief, Robert Gallo, was one of their customers. Hazelton supplied Russian leukemia viruses for Gallo's group at Littleton Bionetics, and there is evidence that Hazelton obtained monkeys from Littleton Bionetics. The CIA's Project MK Naomi was apparently another end user. Twisted Truth and Tales. For all its deception, the Hot Zone chronicled some important events associated with the famous Ebola outbreak. In each chapter, however, Preston managed to either twist the truth or tell tales. Either Preston's hero, Eugene Johnson, those people who work with Ebola are crazy. To mess around with Ebola is an easy way to die. Better to work with something safer, such as anthrax. Mr. Johnson was apparently one such crazy person. According to Preston, he was a civilian biohazard expert who was running the Ebola research program at the Institute. Whenever I thought, would the U.S. Army hire a civilian to run one of its most important top-secret research projects? My suspicions intensified when I heard that Johnson had virtually ransacked Africa looking for these life forms. But besides his searches, he had never found them in their natural hiding places. To find the hidden reservoir of Ebola was one of Johnson's great ambitions. I found it difficult to believe that some slightly loony civilian was going to spend his hard-earned cash and years of work ravaging through the rainforests of Africa to capture a virus that, if touched or breathed, might kill him in days. Preston continued, whatever these Ebola proteins do, they seem to target the immune system for special attack. In this, they are like HIV, which also destroys the immune system, but unlike the onset of HIV, the attack by Ebola is explosive. As Ebola sweeps through you, your immune system fails, and you seem to lose your ability to respond to the viral attack. Your body becomes a city under siege, with its gates thrown open and hostile armies pouring in, making camp in the public squares and setting everything on fire. And from the moment Ebola enters your bloodstream, the war is already lost. You are almost certainly doomed. You can't fight off Ebola the way you fight off a cold. Ebola does in 10 days what it takes AIDS 10 years to accomplish. In Zaire, during the 1976 outbreak, grieving relatives kissed and embraced the dead or prepared the body for burial, and then 3 to 14 later they broke out with Ebola. The virus, Preston wrote, erupted simultaneously in 55 villages surrounding the hospital. This, of course, would have been virtually impossible without the help of a mass vaccination or dissemination program. Otherwise, as Simpson described, the virus would have begun to spread slowly, first from one individual to a few others, then perhaps to many more in a couple of villages. then to several others wiping the first ones out. Despite evidence that Ebola can spread through the air, aerosolized spread could not reconcile large simultaneous outbreaks in 55 villages, unless Mark Chittickney and Alfred Hellman at the National Cancer Institute's experts in viral aerosols dropped them from airplanes. That's huge. I gotta read that. I gotta reread that. Despite the evidence that Ebola can spread through the air, aerosolized spread could not reconcile large simultaneous outbreaks in 55 villages, unless Mark Chittickney and Alfred Hellman, the National Cancer Institute's experts in viral aerosols, dropped them from airplanes. First, it killed people who had received injections, and then it moved through families, killing family members, particularly women, who in Africa prepare the dead for burial. It swept through the Yambuku hospital's nursing staff, killing most of the nurses, and then it hit the Belgian nuns. The first nun to break with Ebola was a midwife who had delivered a stillborn child. The nun's blood was flown to a national laboratory in Antwerp, Belgium, wrote Preston, without mentioning they co-hosted NATO's bioweapons conference in 1970, was one of only 4 labs that in 1977 reported to maintain optimum biocontainment facilities. Fort Detrick was not listed, nor was Gallo's lab at the National Cancer Institute or Bionetics. Only the Special Pathogens branch of the CDC, the Special Pathogens Unit at Portendown, Moscow's Institute of Poliomyelitis and Virus Encephalitis, and Antwerp's Institute of Medicine Tropicale Prince Leopold were listed. Whatever could have possessed the American and British labs to share the word special in their titles? Given the use of the term the CIA and the military denoted secret or covert, I would have thought they might have avoided the interference. The maximum leader of Zaire. According to Preston, not long after the nun's blood was shipped to Europe, the CDC's Special Pathogens Branch Director, Dr. Carl M. Johnson, not to be confused with the eccentric civilian Eugene Johnson mentioned earlier, telephoned a friend of his at the English lab, Portendown, to request a sample of this especially rare blood. And when news of the horrendous outbreak who received the WHO offices in Geneva, the place went into a full-scale alert. People who were there at the time said that you could feel fear in the hallways, and the director looked like a visibly shaken man. By this time, President Mobutu Sese Seko, whom Preston described as the maximum leader of Zaire, sent his army to the Bomba zone. He stationed soldiers around Ngliaima Hospital with orders to let no one enter or leave except doctors. Much of the medical staff was now under quarantine inside the hospital, but the soldiers made sure that the quarantine was enforced. President Mobutu also ordered army units to seal off Bomba zone with roadblocks and shoot anyone trying to come out. Bomba's main link with the outside world was the Congo River. Captains of riverboats had heard about the virus by this time, and they refused to stop their boats anywhere along the length of the river in Bumba, even though people beseeched them from the banks. Then all radio contact with Bumba was lost. No one knew what was happening upriver, who was dying, what the virus was doing. Bumba had dropped off the face of the earth into the silent heart of darkness. The WHO then made contact with Dr. Johnson, who then became the chief of an internal WHO team that gathered the capital city of Kinshasa. Following the orientation, Preston recounted how some of the team flew on the Bumba region in President Mobutu's private plane. The prize-winning author described the aircraft as a C-130 Buffalo transport and an American military aircraft that belonged to the Zairean Air Force. He even detailed with the plane's interior, noting it had been equipped with leopard skin seats, folding beds, and a wet bar of a sort of flying presidential palace that ordinarily took the president and his family on vacation to Switzerland, but now it carried the WHO team into hot zones. Following the Congo River north by east, given Preston's love for fine detail, I thought it odd he failed to mention Mobutu's plane, along with most of Zaire's military hardware, was a gift from Dr. Kissinger, delivered courtesy of the CIA. But the most important factor missed in the hot zone was the turbulent and bizarre relationship between Zaire's supreme dictator and America's supreme imperialist. Shortly preceding the 1976 Ebola outbreak, I recalled that in June 1975, after decades of accepting more than $2 billion in aid from Western allies, Mobutu expelled the American ambassador and arrested most of the CIA's Zairean agents, placing some of them under death sentences. My Africa Diary search showed that preceding this action, the maximum leader of Zaire had criticized the U.S. for following a passive and somewhat negative policy towards Africa. American leaders, he insinuated, spoke of all continents in their major speeches, except Africa. South Africa's policy of granting independence to small tribes under its control was criminal, he said, because it ensued that the free territories would depend completely on South Africa economically. Far worse than his open criticism of Western imperialists, however, was Mobutu's legislative response. In February 1975, he issued orders to nationalize all foreign-owned companies. The Africa Diary reported extensive measures of nationalization, restriction of imports, establishment of agricultural brigades and cooperatives, a ban on religious instruction in schools, and the destruction of all faculties of theology are among decisions made recently by the Political Bureau of the MPR. All places connected with the life of President Mobutu Sese Seko have been proclaimed places of meditation. President Mobutu Azap, the news agency reported, had also declared war on the country's bourgeois, middle class. Speaking at the opening session of the National Assembly, the president accused functionaries who had used their positions to grow rich and influence the nation's commerce. It is not tolerable that the 300 colonial families that pillaged Zaire and who we fought should be replaced by 300 Zairean families, he said. Then, in a move that would have surely and irrevocably irked the ardent papal supporters of the sovereign military order of Malta, Mobutu complained that the walls of schools were decorated with photographs of Pope Paul and crossed while they did not have photographs of the president. Zaire citizens must first know of the man who sacrifices night and day for their happiness before knowing of the Pope and other strangers. He also described Christian religious ceremonies, such as Christmas and Ascension Day, as a form of spiritual alienation repugnant to the public of Zaire. Mobutu later denied he wanted to create a divine aura around the presidency by banning religious education. He also denied that the decisions taken by the government were communist-inspired. He did announce, though, that he had recently visited China and Russia and that these countries, along with North Korea, would soon begin construction of munitions and agricultural machinery plants in Zaire. 6 months later, the CIA was blamed for a failed assassination attempt on Mobutu's life. A year later, Ebola broke out in the Nazara. A year later, Ebola broke out in Nazara along Zaire's northern border. 4 months later, the Ebola Valley was hit. Is there any doubt why Mobutu suddenly reestablished ties with Washington, expelled the Soviet and Cuban diplomats from Zaire, and recanted on many of his social taboos? Damn. Hit you with the Ebola, though. Shit. They don't fuck around. That's it for today. We'll do Chapter 22, the Special Virus Cancer Program, tomorrow.